People who got surprised that day were Custer and his men, who in their famous last stand all lost their lives on a hill that day. So this was a victory for the Native Americans. 14 and a half years later, on December 29th, 1890, the close of the 1800s, a fight broke out near Wounded Knee Creek, again between U.S. Army soldiers and Native Americans. In this case, though, it was a massacre, and several hundred Lakota Sioux tribes people were dead at the end of it, buried in the mass grave, and that effectively closed the chapter that was the Native American resistance to European incursions westward. Now, if you're like me, you've grown up being taught that Native Americans had been here in the Americas for thousands of years. They were primitive, so to speak, in their technology and their ways of life, but it was a very peaceful, nature-loving, nature-respecting existence, and along came the Europeans with their guns of multiple sizes and shapes, who wiped them out in short order because the Native Americans had no such technology with which to resist it. Bows and arrows couldn't stand up to guns. Now, I've discovered in the last few years, from mainstream archaeology of all sources, that this view of the Americas is being overturned. So who are these people? Who did they come from, and what were they doing here before Columbus arrived? We've seen in episode 1, the world is smaller than we think. The history of human population growth shows a spike in the last few hundred years, so that going back just a few generations, maybe 20 generations, there's a lot fewer people to find as a spouse. So you either have to marry someone who's a closer relative than we might be more comfortable with today, or you need to marry someone outside your group. And this is going to begin to connect the family trees of humanities in ways that we hadn't expected. We've also done the math of human population, the math of our ancestors. I have 2 parents, we each have 2 parents, so 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32. And in just 1,000 years, this is still the AD era, Middle Ages, I have, in theory, more ancestors in my family tree than there are people alive on the planet. That can't possibly be true. My parents must be more related to each other than I've previously thought of them as. Which means that if you apply that math around the globe, there must be more connections among the ethnic groups, so-called racial groups, than we're used to thinking about. We've looked at the genetics of this to see how easy racial or ethnic change can occur, just a few generations. This means that if you combine it with the math of human reproductive growth, that in theory, most of Europe could be of recent African descent. We've seen that, in fact, they're of recent Asian descent. And if you go back to episode 4, you can see just how easy it is for this sort of process to occur. We've also seen that the global family tree is much more shallow, much shorter than we used to thinking about, even as young Earth creationists. So we throw out the term 6,000 years, 4,500 years from the time of the flood, which are dramatically different from the evolutionary time scale. If you convert those years, though, to generations, it becomes even more shocking. To go from 8 people at the time of the flood to the nearly 8 billion alive in the world today is just 200 generational steps or less. And so you start to think about, okay, 8 to 8 billion and 200 steps or less. Whoa, that means we have to start connecting the family trees much more quickly than we're used to thinking about. We've also seen, as I mentioned earlier, that it's the male inherited DNA, and you can go back to episodes 5 and 6 to see why it's this specific segment of our DNA that's so key. It doesn't get diluted by the other parent's DNA, by mom's DNA, and it's a clock that exists in our cells. It ticks every generation. It marks off how many generations have passed since, let's say, Ken and I have had a common ancestor, since my wife's family and my family have had a common ancestor. Anyone has had a common ancestor. You can see this then through the global Y chromosome tree. In episode 7, we began to see what this tree tells us about who we come from, beginning with Europe. We've looked for the lost relatives of Europe, seen connections between Britain and India, even though we've grown up thinking that when the East India Company arrived on the shores of India in the 1600s, this was a long-awaited meeting of 2 ancient cultures. Well, in fact, they shared a recent common ancestor in the 1500s. We've seen that there's a good chunk of Europe and of India and of the Middle East and Central Asia that has recent Mongol ancestry. They don't even know it. It's only revealed through the Y chromosome. Consistent with history, but not something we'd expect. We've also seen that another third of Eastern Europe has an ancient Chinese connection. That's not something you'd expect given what we've thought about of China as being this long-standing, isolated culture, which it has been, yet there's these genetic connections that have escaped and slipped through and connected to modern Europe. We looked at who settled the Americas after Columbus in last time, episode 10, and seen that it's primarily Western Europeans, but Western Europeans have recent Central Asian ancestry. And so I think of myself as Caucasian, yet you go back 1,000 years, and lo and behold, or even a few hundred years, and lo and behold, it's Central Asians who are in the family tree, not indigenous Europeans. So that's the hidden history of the Americas. The ancestors of most Americans, and so most Americans, say, at least in the US, are Caucasian. Latin America, there's a heavy European influence, the vast majority of recent European ancestry, yet these Europeans are themselves descendants of Central Asians in the recent past. So today we want to look at the revolution in pre-Columbian history. And to set it up, I want to review what I grew up with, which is probably, I'm assuming, what many of you viewers have grown up with. When I took history in high school, we took world history and we took US history. And so Native Americans were in the context of learning about the history of the United States. So for me growing up, the history of the Americas began with Columbus's arrival in 1492. And then it took a leap forward, talking maybe about Jamestown. That was just in passing. And the real business of the Americas got started in 1620 with the arrival of the Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving, peaceful relationships between the Europeans and the Native Americans. Eventually, history moves to the first 13 colonies. Then the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the War for Independence. And then this moves this new nation inevitably westward as the U.S. acquires the Louisiana Purchase and other parts of the U.S., and people begin to move into these newly acquired territories. And it was this process of arriving on the Atlantic seaboard and pushing westward where we learned about the Native Americans as they were encountered by Europeans. Now, the Native American history for me has always been a gigantic blank spot. I'm used to thinking about the groups of peoples in geographic and ecological categories, woodlands peoples in the Northeast, Plains Indians like the Sioux in the Midwest. And of course, we learned first about the Iroquois and Mohawk and other Northeastern groups, because that's where the Europeans first arrived. And so we learned about their ways of life and their cultures, their longhouses, their weapons, which I always found fascinating. Also their hairstyles, obviously, to this day I still find very interesting and appreciated. But in terms of weaponry, grew up with the idea that they were no match for European guns. And so inevitably then, you see early in U.S. history, forcible removals of Native Americans from their homelands westward. So the Trail of Tears, moving the Chickasaw and Choctaw and Cherokee and